Our gender is, put this up here, our gender is sacred, and the evil one wants to destroy it. All right, that's the first thing. That's what she starts off with in chapter 3. What God made us to be, male or female, that's something sacred, and that's why the devil wants to destroy it, because it's of God, it's sacred. And the way he's attempting to destroy this is through what secular psychologists today use to explain gender. Okay, this is all man-made, right? This is all man-made. Here's 4 things, again, the 4 categories of gender. Biological sex, that's what your body looks like. The way God created you. But then they say, just as important is your gender identity. How do you feel? Doesn't matter what you look like. Doesn't matter what your biology is. What do you feel like? Do you feel male or female? That's important. That's part of your gender, they say. Gender expression, number 3, is what we look like. We decide, they say. You can decide if you want to look male or female. Again, it doesn't matter what God created you to be. You can be male or female or in between, right? Androgynous. And that's how you dress, how you act, what you look like. And then the last one is sexual orientation, who you're attracted to. That's part of your gender. Whoever you feel an attraction to, that's valued, and that's part of your gender. So, for example, someone who is biologically female could feel like a male, could dress like a male, and be attracted to females. They say that's fine. That's all part of it. Or a biological male might identify as a female, dress like a female, and be attracted to other males. Right? And they say that's all important, that's all valued. So these are the 4 categories that that psychologists use to explain sexual brokenness, says Dr. Seiler. But again, all these are man-made ideas. They're all man-made, and she says they're man-made, they're created, they're human constructs, is the way she says it, in order to support same-sex relationships, in order to support transgender beliefs. So in the year 2011, a man by the name of Sam Killerman created a visual tool that he calls the gender person. The genderbread person. Boy, I'm really off right now. The genderbread person. Right? This is a genderbread person. And he created this tool, this visual tool, to help people visualize and, according to him, and understand the complexities of gender. Right? Again, these are all man-made because gender is not that complex, but to explain all the brokenness, this is what they come up with. All right, so we've got these are the 4 categories. You see them up here. At the top, you have the gender identity. You see the scale there, the gamut. Gender expression is another one. Biological sex. This is what we look like biologically. And then the sexual orientation. And I actually went to his website because in the book, I don't know if you noticed, but in the book, she uses this image and she says it's used by permission. So he gave her permission to use this. But I went to the link, and he's just got a whole website of explaining, and he's actually refined this from 2011 when he first created it. He's kind of refined it, made it a little better, according to him. But again, the important thing to remember is that, again, these are human constructs. These are man-made ideas. And unlike the ideas in the genderbread person, God's original plan for sexuality is that our biological sex, our gender identity, our sexual attractions, they should all match. They should all match. They should all align. Instead of, like on this genderbread person, the 4 categories, it could be all different. Doesn't matter. In God's original plan, those things should all align. They should all match. For For example, God made females to think of themselves as female, to express themselves as female through their bodies. In other words, to look like females and to be attracted to males. That's the way that God made females. In the same way God created males to think of themselves as male, to look like males, and to be attracted to females. And when a person's gender identity or attractions don't match their biological sex, then obviously something's wrong. It's not that God made a mistake. It's not that they were born to just be that way. They could have been born with certain inclinations, but again, they weren't born to be that way. Instead, it shows that something is out of balance. She says something is out of balance in their mind, in their emotions, in their will. Which, by the way, who do we call? We've talked about this in the past recently. What do we call mind, will, and emotions? The mind, will, and emotions is our soul. That's our soul. Our soul is comprised of mind, will, and emotions. So something is out of balance in our soul, in a person's soul, whose gender and expression and attractions aren't aligned. There's something wrong in the soul, the mind, and the will, and the emotions. Sometimes it's, ultimately, I guess it comes down to the will, but we can't ignore the fact something's wrong in the mind, something's wrong in the emotions, because their inner self, their gender identity, doesn't align with their body that God has given them. So I like this verse, these verses, Ephesians 4:22 through 24. Reads like this: You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. I love that, because that's what needs to happen. When there is something wrong in the soul, the gender and the biological sex aren't aligning, the desires aren't aligning with who God made us to be, then there's something wrong in the soul, mind, will, emotions. How do we handle that? Do we handle it by saying, okay, well, you have these 4 options, just, mix and match, you can do whatever? No, what we have to understand, what the Bible tells us to do, what God tells us to do, is that we put off that old way, that old self, and we're made new in the attitude of our minds. Remember, we were talking about mind, will, and emotion, our soul. So it needs to start with transformation that God does in our soul, in our mind. And then in verse 24, we put on the new self, created to be like God. Remember, we talked last week about how we're, because we're made in the image of God, we reflect the 3 characteristics of God. That's what he's saying. We put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. So God made us, in his image. And so we have to understand, okay, when something is not right, what's the answer? Do we give in to the temptation? Do we give in to the culture? Do we give in, now it's legal to marry somebody of the same sex, so I guess that means it's okay? No, we ask God to renew our mind. I heard somebody say, when somebody says about their same-sex attractions, but hey, I can't help it, I was born this way. Well, that's why you need to be born again, and that's what Ephesians 4:23 and 24. That's what Romans 12:2 talks about, being renewed, being transformed by the renewing of our mind. The transformation comes by our mind, and that's something God does. Now, is it easy? No. I mean, there's so many things, like Brother Johnny said, coming against that person who is wanting to do the right thing and wanting to be renewed. But God can do that. God made us spiritual beings who have a soul, and we live in a physical body. Now, because of the fall, Every part of us was affected. Our spirit, our soul, and our bodies. Our spirits, our souls, and our bodies were affected. Our body was affected too. You know, I say that because some people think, and this is not right, some people wrongly think that the body is not important. The body, in fact, some people will say, well, the body is bad. The only thing that matters to God is the soul and the spirit. That's why when people die, we bury their body, but their soul and the spirit go to heaven. And that kind of thinking is wrong. And it leads to the false belief then that salvation is only about the spiritual and ignores the physical aspect of our being. And this is why, if you ever wondered why somebody who acts on same-sex desires, you know, has a same-sex relationship, or maybe even a sex reassignment surgery, why they say they're Christians. You think, how can you say you're a Christian? You know, because you know, look how you're living. No. Their belief is it doesn't matter. That doesn't matter because what I do with my body doesn't affect, you know, my spirit and my soul. I'm still a Christian. I did something with my body. And so they separate the two. They separate the two. A person can act on same-sex desires or have sex reassignment surgery and still be saved, they think, but that's not true. They say, I can do that and I'm still reflecting God's image. That's really the belief. You know, Christians who practice same-sex relationship and desire, give in to those desires, to say, hey, I can do that and I'm still reflecting God's image. But can you see, though, by looking back at what we talked about last week and we reviewed today about the how we reflect the image of God, how you see that doesn't reflect the image of God. It doesn't reflect the unity and diversity. Last week we talked about some examples. And why is this wrong? Well, that's just too much unity, right? Same sex. Why is this wrong? Well, that's too much diversity, you know. I mean, there has to be a balanced unity and diversity. So that belief, let me get back to this belief that people say, you know, my soul and spirit are different from my body. If I change my body, I'm in soul and spirit, I'm still a Christian. They separate the two. That's nothing more than a very old philosophy from the 2nd century known as Gnosticism. Has anybody ever heard of Gnosticism? This goes back to way back, you know, like I said, hundreds of years. Gnosticism, and people refer to it as Gnostic dualism because it separates into two. Gnosticism is a belief or the philosophy that the universe is built on two opposing principles. There's the material and there's the spiritual. You just separate the universe into the material and the spiritual. And Gnosticism says the material doesn't matter. The material is bad. It's even evil. The spiritual is good, right? And that's really what this is. People who say, well, the material of the body doesn't matter. I can still be a Christian because the spiritual, you know, I'm aligned with God. But we got to remember that God's image in us includes our spiritual side and our physical, our bodies as well. God's image in us includes our bodies and our sexuality, both of which were distorted by the fall. And because of the fall, I think because of the fall, people, you know, even us to a certain extent, we resist God's design for our physical bodies. That's why God's plan for salvation includes God's plan to deliver and to save our physical bodies. It bothers me, I have to be honest with you, it bothers me when I hear people say that, and sometimes I even hear ministers in funerals say things. But, you know, the person you see here, he's just a shell, right? And I understand the spirit and soul have gone on to be with Jesus. They're like, you know, I heard somebody say, this body is nothing. I'm looking at you through these two little windows, but this body is nothing. I'm like, no, our body is something. That's why we're going to have glorified bodies. That's why when we get to heaven, we're going to have glorified bodies. Now, I don't want to get into this, but there's a question, and I'll just throw this out there. People say, okay, so like our loved ones that are in heaven right now, do they not have a body? Are they spirits floating around? Do they have a temporary body? I believe, and I'm not going to get into the reasons why, but I believe that they do have a temporary body. It's not their glorified body. Because when Jesus comes back with the saints, they're not just coming back, He's not coming back in spirit. He's coming back physically. And the implication is that those that are coming back with him are coming back physically. So anyway, we don't have time to get into that. But the point I'm trying to make is that our bodies are part of our salvation. Our bodies are part of our redemption. So don't ever say, well, the body's not important. Yeah, we'll be resurrected at the second coming of Jesus. But no, right now our bodies are important. Right now our bodies are part of what God created. This is what we have to take care of our bodies now, and align our bodies with God's nature, the unity and diversity. Questions or thoughts? Brother? Yeah, I understand. Right. And that's why, going back to this verse here, that's why it says, to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires. The desires are wrong. Right? In this case, we're talking about same-sex desires are wrong, and to be made new in the attitude of your mind. So we can try to hit them over the head with the Bible, right? I've been telling you, please understand that what we're learning today is not so we can use it in a cultural war and tell people, even what I just said to you, when people say, I was born this way, well, that's why you need to be born again. Even if you say that, we have to be careful that we're not just trying to convince them by our reasoning. I have things that I could throw out to people, but I don't, because I'm just praying that God will make them new in the attitude of their minds. That God will transform them, Romans 12:2, by the renewing of their minds. Because you're right, brother, we can't convince them. They've accepted, they've made up their own rules, I don't know how many times I hear people talking about, no, but this is the way I was, God made me this way, whatever, and this is normal, this is natural. And I want to say things, and I don't, but I want to say things like, well, okay, so you say, you're female with a female, you say that's normal. I said, but have you noticed that in same-sex relationships, there's always one masculine person and one feminine person? So, okay, do you see how that even in your wrong relationship, you're showing God's order, because you got a masculine and a feminine, right? And I could hit them over the head with that, but that's not really, and that's good maybe for us to understand, and if somebody's willing to hear discussion. But unless God renews them in their mind, are hitting them over the head, even with Bible passages. We're going to study next week some Bible passages. It's important. But again, I'm not trying to give you tools to try to reason or try to hammer it in people's heads. Instead, let's pray for their minds to be renewed. Let's pray for God, because there's some confusion there. And we talked last week about, I'll mention this, and we'll probably mention it again next week. But we talked last week about how we read passages in the Old Testament, in Leviticus, which says that a man should not lie with a man because that is an abomination. We think, oh man, that's awful. That's the worst sin because that's an abomination. And yet the Bible calls lying an abomination, calls pride an abomination. So, I mean, we're not placing ourselves over them. We get tempted maybe in other ways. But ultimately, we need to just believe that God will heal their minds and make them new in the attitude of their minds. So last week and this week, then we've covered, why God forbids same-sex relationships, and ultimately, we've said that two people of the same sex cannot reflect the unity and diversity of God. The unity in diversity of God. They cannot reflect a covenant relationship that has the potential to create life. They cannot reflect a relationship that is part of the gospel message. Right? And if we don't start, and the reason we've taken time to cover this last week and this week is if we don't start with the gospel and God's mission, then people can use the Bible verses and twist verses to fit their own ideas. And that's what's happening today. Just happening today because people take verses and they twist them to convince themselves or try to convince others that God condones same-sex relationships. Because they started just with the cultural belief instead of going back to what does the Bible say? You know, there are some progressive Christians that claim to follow Jesus, but they want to support same-sex relationships. And they argue that it's okay because Christians have misunderstood the Bible. Oh, those verses, yeah, you don't really understand the context. And that's really nothing more than them saying what Satan said to Eve in the Garden of Eden. Did God really say? And that's what we hear from some progressive Christians. For example, some people want to change and want to change traditional biblical views by pointing out that the Bible only mentions same-sex behavior in 6 passages. They say, look, the only place it's mentioned in the Bible is 6 times, 3 in the Old Testament, 3 in the New Testament, only 6. You think if it was really important, if God really cared about this, it would be all over the Bible. That's an argument that some progressive Christians use. So they say, you know, same-sex relationships, homosexuality must not really matter to God. So the answer to that, I think, is that we have to understand that the main purpose of the Bible isn't to focus on sexuality. We know that, right? The main focus of the Bible is to reveal who God is. That's the purpose of the Bible, right? His design for creation, his plan to save humanity and restore a relationship with him. So it's not about counting verses. Oh, there's only 6 verses against homosexuality. Must not be that important to God. No, it's not about counting verses. It's about asking, does this align with God's nature? Does this align with the gospel message? So, you know, okay, you want to know why is it really true that it's only mentioned 3 times in the Old Testament and 3 in the New? Yeah. You might, well, why only 6 times? Well, because it doesn't need to be mentioned often in the Bible because it doesn't align with the gospel. And so when it is mentioned, it's mentioned to show that it doesn't align with God's nature and with God's view of sexuality. So Dr. Seiler calls these people revisionists. They want to revise, they want to change what the Bible biblical teachings are. And in order to do that, they have to overlook certain things. They have to overlook how our sexuality reflects the gospel. Because homosexuality does not reflect the nature of God, does not reflect the gospel. They have to overlook verses that condemn it. And they say, well, that's not really what it meant. We'll talk more specifically about that next week. But the reality is that even, you know, okay, it's mentioned homosexuality is mentioned 3 times in the Old Testament, 3 in the New, and in none of those times is there a positive mention of it. Every time it's mentioned, it's condemned. Every time it's mentioned, it's condemned, which is quite a contrast from a sexual relationship between a man and a woman. In the Bible, when it talks about relationships between a man and a woman, a husband and wife, it's used to explain how that marriage relationship and that physical relationship reflects the gospel within the context of marriage. It reflects the gospel. You don't find that about same-sex behavior in the Bible. You don't find any verses that bless same-sex behavior because it goes against the gospel. It goes against the Bible. So, and next week we'll look at some passages that some progressive Christians use to say that the Bible condones homosexuality.
It can be very confusing.